This is Magdala. It's hot right now, but it's wonderful. You have seen our other Classroom Traveler video on Duke in Altum, the church over across the site here. But right now, Dr. Hudson, we have something very exciting here. Would you tell us about this?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, as we talked about earlier today on the bus. 20 years ago, we did not know that this site was here. And so a little grocery store, shopping complex right over there.
Right past that.
They brought some bulldozers in here. They were going to expand these shops. And they literally stumbled on this first century village, and in particular, so beautifully, this first century synagogue.
You're understanding now. This is a first century synagogue. This is the time of Christ. This one has an unusual feature. But you're saying this would be a place that Jesus could have been in.
Maybe so. He may have been a little early for this because they haven't been able to, as far as my understanding is, they haven't been able to date this exactly, so they kind of approximate between 20 and 60, somewhere in the first century. But what's interesting is that this site has been here since at least 200 BCE. And scholars think that maybe this site was settled by the Hasmoneans, the Maccabeans, during this time. And it was, of course, a Jewish settlement. And eventually they developed this synagogue. And so this synagogue, now I'm going to go kind of off the record here, this synagogue may be much older, a little bit older than the first century, but once they came to these ruins, they realized that they were in one of the oldest synagogues in existence. And so probably the oldest synagogue is maybe the one that we see up on Masada that we'll see in a couple of days, that you and I've seen before. But most of the synagogues only go back to the 3rd and the 4th century. When we go over here in Capernaum, there was an earthquake in the late 300s, and it destroyed the first synagogue. And of course, they built on top of that. They built a magnificent synagogue on top of that. But that means that we can't get to the first century synagogue. We get to the first century synagogue here, and what we find is, in some ways, some real surprises. But not really. This is how the synagogues look in other areas, sometimes even though they're separated by 200 or 300 years. And so you'll notice as we
Take a look at this.
get close to the synagogue, and put your camera over there, this would have been the entrance. I mentioned that we're in basalt country, volcanic ash rock, and a lot of the foundation is built on basalt, and this was basically for reasons of wet and rain, and making sure that it's got a good foundation. And basalt is typically impermeable by water, and so we can see now that this is the entrance. Debate about what exactly this is back here. It's some type of a courtyard, might have been where the women were, and might have been an addition. But you go into the major part of the synagogue over here, and you go down the thoroughfare, you go down the hallway here, and you have the Magdala stone. Now that's a facsimile, but that's pretty much where they discovered it. That's supposed to be in situ. And this is quite a remarkable stone. They don't know if it is a table. Is it really a facsimile of the Ark, even though it's a stone? Did they bring out their scrolls and use this to read their scrolls? Nobody really knows, but it's been there for 2,000 years, or almost close to 2,000 years, and it gives us an idea of what they thought and how they lived. And once again, you see that the scrolls are the central aspect of the synagogue. They don't really, in many ways, like we talked about earlier, this is not a temple. There was only one temple. There were multiple synagogues, and every significant village, city, town had its synagogue. And this has always been a small village, but it's a magnificent synagogue. And so they have this Magdala stone there's really there's no representation, no human, animal, deity representation. It's simple, it's elegant.
And that's very important, that there is no animal representation, anything like that. It's just designs, correct?
It's geometrics, and also the rosettes. Now we got to be careful with that, because you go up to Sepphoris, to Zipori, and you look at, it's an older synagogue. They got the zodiac in there, so it's not that all the Jews, again, across cultures and centuries, people assimilate. And now you're not going to find a rendering or a mosaic of Yahweh. You're never probably going to find that.
Right.
But in Zipori, they do have renderings. But here, this is quite typical. So they've got this beautiful quote unquote table, this beautiful ark, and as I said earlier, this synagogue is divided into 3 sections.
Yeah, can you see that? The 3? You see them, and they seem pretty obvious, don't they? As you divide it, you can almost sweep your hand down through the sections here. And you were mentioning before, now I see, am I correct on this? These benches where people would be to hear the reading of the Torah on there. And then tell us about the pillar. That pillar back there in the back, as you see that, you were telling us about, that makes it unique.
Yeah, those pillars are columns. And the columns, you can see the mortar back there, and the paint on it. They actually coated this with mortar, and so right now you look at these rough rocks and you're like, oh my goodness, that's ugly. But this was quite beautiful. They put mortar over this, and so most of this was plastered, and you could see that back there on the
Dr.
columns.
Hudson, you keep telling, and let's walk around, let's get close to it as he shows it. But go ahead, keep explaining it.
But again, you've got these 3 sections, and if you go into any church in Europe, if you're going to have architecture, especially ancient architecture, to any sense of scale, you've got to be able to support the expanse. And these columns were gorgeous, they were beautiful, but they were also functional. And so you've got, this is a third of the synagogue, the second third, and the third third, and the columns probably ran this way, and they would support a magnificent roof up here. And so there's the Magdala stone. You can see very closely, you can see now the plaster, the mortar that covers this pillar. And then we also come to, I think, one of the most beautiful things from the ancient world.
Yes, absolutely.
This mosaic that, once again, in situ, this is an original mosaic. May have been later, may have been done later than the 1st century. But once again, you can notice this is geometric.
Yes.
No animal, human, deity representation.
And if you see that now, some of you students are wondering why we have ripples through here, ground settlement, and there was a huge earthquake in the history of this synagogue, correct?
There was, in the Galilee. There have been a number of earthquakes in this area. But, I mean, look, that's almost 2,000 years old.
Amazing find, and we're constantly coming on surprises as we make our tour here with the Classroom Traveler series. You're going to find all sorts of just amazing things. Help understand what the Bible has to offer you, and then grasping things and getting pictures behind the readings of your scripture. And so, thank you, Dr. Hudson. This is just an amazing thing. You had something else?
Yeah, if I could say 2 more things. One, don't forget, this is Magdala. This is Magdala. Mary was probably from here. This is the town of Mary Magdalene. And I'm going to come back and say, yes, you're absolutely right. It's fair to say Jesus may have been in the synagogue. Mary Magdalene may have been in the synagogue. Of course, we can't say it with any certainty, and so I'm not going to say it. But this was an important 1st century Jewish area. And of course, you went down here and you walked the path that everybody would have walked. Anybody coming from the Galilee would go around the sea and then on down to Jerusalem, Jericho, so forth and so on, along the Jordan Valley. And then, so this is the city, if you will, the village of Mary Magdalene. And if you can get in there close, you'll notice that on this Magdala stone is a menorah. Do you see that menorah?
You see it right in the center there, right in the middle
so
on this side.
So you got a picture on the left, you got a picture on the right, not picture, but picture on the left, picture on the right, and the menorah right there. And so this in many ways, is not only a deep connection to Jewish thought, but also to the temple.
Excellent.
Candlesticks.